Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're diving into Come Up Hither, a sermon by Pastor Jerry A's that you all sent in.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a YouTube video
Mm-hmm.
from December 8th, 2024.
Okay.
And honestly, this sermon, even if you aren't religious, it's a powerful call to action.
It really is. One of the things that struck me the most was
Yeah.
the way Pastor Eze really skillfully intertwines these biblical teachings, with everyday relatable experiences.
Right.
So he doesn't just throw out abstract concepts, but he actually provides listeners with these practical ways to apply them to their lives.
Okay, so right off the bat, he introduces this concept of come up hither.
Yes.
Right, which is
Yeah.
all about ascending to a higher spiritual plane.
Mm-hmm.
And he emphasizes that there's a difference between worldly success and divine elevation.
And it's not just about, achieving some vague sense of spiritual enlightenment.
Yeah.
He argues that true fulfillment comes from aligning your goals with a purpose that transcends your individual needs. And so he stresses that, lasting progress stems from a divine source, suggesting it's not just hard work or luck.
So it's more than just positive thinking, right? There's this element of faith and surrendering to something larger than yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And his energetic delivery, it really drives that point home.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, this isn't passive, this is active, this is forward and upward movement.
This part really made me think. So he talks about the story of Jesus' transfiguration on Mount Tabor.
Right.
Right. And so Pastor Ezi poses this really thought-provoking question. He's like, what if Peter, James, and John had joined Jesus in prayer?
Mm-hmm.
Would they have experienced the same transformation? It's like he's suggesting that we have a responsibility to actively participate in our own spiritual development.
It really challenges the notion of passive belief,
Right.
isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not enough to just sit back and wait for something to happen.
Right.
You have to engage in the practices that actually facilitate growth.
And that's where he brings in this really clever analogy of spiritual disciplines being like medicine capsules.
Oh, yeah, I love that.
He talks about how when he was a kid,
Mm-hmm.
his mom used to open up the capsules and just give him the medicine inside
Right,
because the capsule itself wasn't important.
right.
And he argues that we often avoid those capsules, right?
Yeah.
The sometimes unpleasant practices that contain the potential for real transformation.
It's such a vivid image, right?
Totally.
He's basically saying, yes, the discipline might not be enjoyable, but the growth that it leads to is the real treasure.
So what are some examples of those capsules, those spiritual disciplines that we might be avoiding?
Well, he mentions several throughout the sermon.
All right.
Fasting, for example, is a practice found in many spiritual traditions.
Right.
It's about abstaining from food
Hmm.
for a specific period of time, and it's often seen as a way to cultivate self-control, focus the mind, and deepen one's connection to the divine.
I've also heard of people incorporating fasting into their routines for health reasons too, not just spiritual.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's prayer, which he talks about extensively.
Right.
And prayer is a form of communication with a higher power,
Right.
whether you call that God, the universe, or something else entirely.
Yeah.
And it can take many forms, from silent contemplation to spoken words.
Okay.
And it's often used to express gratitude, seek guidance, or ask for support.
So it's not just about asking for things.
Not at all. It's more about cultivating a relationship,
Hmm.
a sense of connection to something bigger than yourself.
Okay.
And then there's meditation, which is about quieting the mind and cultivating a state of inner stillness.
Right.
And this can involve focusing on the breath, repeating a mantra, or simply observing thoughts and feelings without judgment.
It sounds like all of these disciplines require a certain level of commitment and effort. It's not just a one-time thing.
Exactly. They're practices that you cultivate over time.
Right.
And the benefits, they kind of unfold gradually as you integrate them into your life.
This makes me wonder, so if spiritual disciplines are the medicine that we need,
Right.
how do we know if we're spiritually unwell in the first place?
That's a great question, and that's where Pastor Eze introduces this concept of spiritual sleep.
Okay, so he describes spiritual sleep as a state where we're physically awake, but not fully attuned to our spiritual potential or God's purpose for our lives.
Right.
It's like we're sleepwalking through life, missing out on opportunities and ignoring those little nudges from our intuition.
He's not talking about physical sleep, of course,
Right.
but rather a kind of spiritual slumber,
Hmm.
where we might be going through the motions but not truly engaged with our lives.
Okay.
And he outlines 5 signs that we might be in this state of spiritual sleep.
This is where it gets really interesting. And I think even if you're not coming at this from a religious perspective, these signs are super relatable and relevant.
Absolutely. These are things that, we can all fall prey to.
Yeah.
Regardless of our beliefs, the first sign is not understanding God's purpose for your life.
Okay.
And, this doesn't mean you need to have, your entire life mapped out.
Right.
But rather, having a sense of direction, like a feeling of being on the right path.
So it's not about knowing every single step, but just having a general sense of where you're headed.
Exactly. And it's not always a straight line.
Right.
Sometimes we take detours, make mistakes, and that's all part of the journey.
Yeah.
But if we're consistently feeling lost and directionless, that could be a sign that we're spiritually asleep.
Okay, the second sign he mentions is not aligning with God's purpose.
Yes.
It's one thing to have a sense of purpose.
Right.
It's another thing entirely to live in alignment with it.
He uses this powerful example talking about Peter leaving everything behind to follow Jesus after experiencing a miraculous catch of fish.
Right.
It's like saying, okay, the material blessings are great, but the real prize is aligning with a purpose that gives my life meaning.
Yeah, it's about walking the walk.
Yes.
Not just talking the talk.
Precisely. The third sign Pastor Ise points out is not being sensitive to times and seasons.
Okay.
And this is about being aware of the natural rhythms of life, the ebb and flow of energy, the opportunities that present themselves at different stages.
This reminds me of something I read recently about how different cultures perceive time.
Oh, yeah.
Some cultures are very linear, focusing on deadlines and schedules, while others are more cyclical, seeing time as this spiral that keeps returning to the same points, but at a higher level.
That's a great connection.
Yeah.
And, Pastor Ise is essentially saying that we need to be attuned to these cycles, both internal and external.
Okay.
Are we forcing things when it's time to rest? Are
Right.
we missing opportunities because we're not paying attention?
It's about being present and responsive to what life is presenting to us in each moment.
Exactly. And the fourth sign he mentions is partnering with your own destruction.
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Yeah. This is a tough one, but it's so important.
Right.
He's talking about those self-sabotaging behaviors that we all engage in from time to time.
That's for sure.
Those patterns that hold us back from reaching our full potential.
Yeah, we're our own worst enemies sometimes.
And he doesn't shy away from the difficult truth that we all have these tendencies.
Right.
It's part of being human, but the key is to become aware of them.
Yeah.
So we can start to make different choices.
So it's not about beating ourselves up for our mistakes.
Right.
But rather learning from them and choosing a different path.
Precisely. And the fifth and final sign of spiritual sleep that he mentions is not understanding the agency of encounters.
This one really stood out to me because it's he's saying that every interaction, every experience has the potential to be a divine appointment, like a moment of awakening or transformation.
He encourages us to view every encounter as an opportunity for growth.
Okay.
A chance to learn something new about ourselves or the world around us.
So it's about being present.
Yes.
And open to the possibilities in each moment.
Exactly. And I think that's a powerful message.
Right.
Regardless of your spiritual beliefs, it's a reminder to pay attention.
Right.
To be present, to see the sacred in the ordinary.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. After discussing spiritual sleep, Pastor E.A. dives into this incredible power we can unlock through prayer.
Yes.
And again, I think we can apply these ideas even if we're not coming at this from a strictly religious perspective.
I completely agree. He outlines 5 dimensions of power that can be experienced through prayer. And these concepts resonate deeply with me, even outside of a purely religious context.
Let's delve into those.
Yeah.
What's the first dimension of power he discusses?
The first one he mentions is the power to become your future self.
Okay.
And he uses the example of Jesus's transfiguration as a kind of prefiguring of his resurrected, glorified state. It's as if through prayer, he's accessing a potential that's already there, waiting to be realized.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's prayer is a tool for manifesting your highest vision of yourself. And I think we can all relate to that desire to become the best versions of ourselves.
Absolutely. It's about tapping into that inherent potential that resides within each of us.
Right.
And using prayer as a means to cultivate and nurture it.
So prayer isn't just about asking for things, but it's about aligning with our higher selves
Yes.
and calling forth that potential into being.
Exactly. And the second dimension of power he discusses is aligning with purpose.
Okay.
And as we touched on earlier, it's not just about achieving things, but about making sure those achievements are in service to something larger than ourselves.
This reminds me of something you mentioned earlier about Peter leaving everything behind to follow Jesus.
Yes.
It's like, yeah, the material blessings are great,
Right.
but the real prize is aligning with a purpose that gives my life meaning.
It's about finding that sweet spot where your passions and talents intersect with a need in the world. And prayer can be a powerful tool for discerning that purpose and staying aligned with it.
It's like asking for guidance and then trusting those intuitive nudges that point us in the right direction.
Exactly. The third dimension of power Pastor Easy's highlights is building personal capacity.
Yeah.
It's about developing that inner strength and resilience that allows you to weather life's storms.
He makes the point that even though the disciples weren't praying alongside Jesus during the Transfiguration, Jesus' spirit didn't fail.
Right.
It's like prayer cultivates this inner reservoir of strength that's always available,
Right.
even when we feel alone or unsupported.
It's about cultivating that unshakable core that allows us to remain grounded and centered no matter what challenges we face. Prayer can be a source of strength and solace, reminding us that we're never truly alone.
It's like building that inner foundation that can withstand any external pressure.
Precisely. Now, the fourth dimension of power he delves into is shifting our confidence from man to God.
Okay.
He talks about how when we pray less, we tend to put our confidence in people. Right.
And then our happiness becomes dependent on their approval or validation.
That makes a lot of sense. Like when we're feeling insecure or uncertain, we often seek validation from external sources.
But when we cultivate a strong connection with something larger than ourselves, whether that's God or some other higher power, we become less reliant on external validation.
It's like we're tapping into an internal source of strength and worthiness that doesn't depend on the opinions of others.
Exactly. He talks about this sense of joy and inner peace that comes from knowing you're loved and supported by something beyond human approval.
Right.
It's like people can have their opinions, but my worth isn't determined by them.
It's a really empowering message. And what's the final dimension of power that he talks about?
The fifth and final dimension is reducing our reliance on external validation.
Okay, so that ties in beautifully with the previous point.
Yes, it does.
Right? It's about recognizing that our true worth isn't dependent on what other people think of us. He uses this humorous example of someone questioning whether speaking in tongues is a valid expression of faith.
Okay.
His response is essentially, was it all you 2 years ago? Was it all you last year? Keep evolving, keep growing.
I love that. It's like, don't let other people's limited understanding define your spiritual journey.
Yeah.
It's your journey.
Yes.
And you get to define what that looks and feels like for you.
He emphasizes that the most important thing is knowing that you're loved and accepted by a higher power.
Okay.
And when you have that kind of unshakable foundation, external validation just doesn't hold the same sway anymore.
That's such a powerful idea.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm not seeking your approval.
Right.
I'm seeking my own alignment with what's true and meaningful for me.
And he concludes by urging his listeners to really lean into prayer, especially during times of transition.
Okay.
He emphasizes the importance of listening to God, of
Right.
quieting the mind, and really tuning into that inner voice.
And he makes this really interesting point that sometimes the biggest talking happens not out loud,
Right.
but within our own hearts.
Yes.
It's like all those anxieties, doubts, and limiting beliefs that can swirl around in our heads and drown out any kind of intuitive wisdom.
He encourages us to be mindful of that inner chatter
Okay.
and to cultivate the discipline of listening, both to ourselves and to something beyond ourselves.
He even goes so far as to say, when you're in a season of transition, listen more than you're talking. You're one instruction away from laughter.
That's such a beautiful image.
Yeah.
It's like if we can just quiet ourselves and really tune in, we might hear the guidance that leads us to joy and fulfillment.
Yeah, that image of being one instruction away from laughter really resonates with me.
Right.
It's like we're all on this journey searching for that inner compass.
Yeah.
Guide us.
And Pastor Isaiah doesn't just leave us with these like beautiful metaphors, you know?
Right.
He also offers like practical advice for how to navigate this journey of, coming up hither.
Okay.
He emphasizes the importance of discernment.
Uh-huh.
It's not enough to just listen to any voice that whops into our heads.
Right.
You need to be able to distinguish between, our ego's desires
Mhm.
and the whispers of our soul.
Or a higher guidance.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do we develop that discernment? Because it sounds like a pretty crucial skill for this whole coming up hither thing.
He suggests checking our motivations.
Oh.
Are we seeking validation from others?
Mhm.
Are we driven by fear or ego?
Right.
Or are we genuinely seeking alignment with our higher purpose?
It's like taking a step back and asking,
Yeah.
why am I doing this?
Yes.
What's the underlying intention here?
Exactly. And he also cautions against blindly following the advice of just anyone.
Okay.
He reminds us that not everyone is operating at the same level of consciousness
Right.
or aligned with the same values.
He uses this really striking analogy
Oh, yeah.
of someone wanting to build a skyscraper
Yeah.
and seeking advice from someone who's only built modest huts.
Right.
It's like, yeah, their advice might be great for building a hut,
Yeah.
but it's not going to cut it for a skyscraper.
It's a reminder that we need to be discerning about whose advice we take
Right.
and make sure their perspective aligns with the scale of our dreams and ambitions.
So it's not about dismissing everyone else's opinions,
Right.
but rather being selective and choosing mentors who resonate with our vision.
Precisely. Surround yourself with people who not only believe in your potential,
Yeah.
but who are also actively pursuing their own growth and evolution.
Mm-hmm.
It's that idea of iron sharpens iron.
I love that.
We elevate each other when we're all striving to reach higher levels of, awareness and impact.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive.
It has.
We've covered so much ground, from recognizing the signs of spiritual sleep to understanding the transformative power of prayer and spiritual discipline.
And it all circles back to Pastor as a central message.
Yeah.
This powerful call to come up hither.
Right.
It's an invitation to rise above limitations,
Mm-hmm.
both internal and external, and step into a life of greater purpose, meaning, and joy.
He reminds us that we all have this incredible potential within us.
Yeah.
This capacity for transformation and growth. But it requires a conscious effort,
Right.
a willingness to embrace discomfort, and a
Yeah.
commitment to aligning with our higher purpose.
So as you reflect on this sermon,
Yeah.
I encourage you to consider, what capsules might you be avoiding in your own life? What steps can you take to wake up from spiritual slumber
Right.
and step into a greater sense of purpose and fulfillment?
This has been a truly inspiring conversation.
It has. Thank you for having me.
A huge thank you to you for sharing this sermon with us and for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, the journey of coming up hither is a continuous process of growth and evolution.
Absolutely.
See you next time.